Baruch Atah Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Lord our God, rule the universe, who's made us holy with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. And with that, we're going to start with a review of what we did previously, and then we'll move on. So, on one foot, the four children is something in the Magid section of the Haggdah. It talks about four children, one wise, one wicked, one simple, one who does not know how to ask. Sometimes these are referred to as the four sons, but the word banim could be sons or children, and we might as well be inclusive. So we looked at the introductory text, blessed be the place of all, blessed be God, and so on, and then talking about the four children. We talked about how this comes up because in the Torah it says four times, you should tell your children about Passover. So it's assumed that there must be four different children getting four different answers. Otherwise, the Torah would have just said this once and been done with it. We have a video of the most common tune for Baruch HaMakom, and I learned a little bit about it. And then we looked at the biblical source texts for each of the four times when it says, when you tell your child, or when your child asks, you should say some explanation. And we talked about which child we might think that verse went with. So one from Exodus chapter 12, two from Exodus chapter 13, and then one from Deuteronomy chapter 6, right after the Shkan V'Ahavta. Oh. This brings us to step 2, which is the Mechilta. Morris, would you please read from the Mechilta?
Mechilta, the Rabbi Yishmael 13:14:1. There are four children, a wise child, a wicked child, a simple child, and one who does not know how to ask. What does the wise child say? What are the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments that the Lord our God commanded us? You, likewise, open to him in the halachot of Pesach. We don't eat after the hafikomen. What does the wicked child say? Exodus 12:26. What is this Pesach service to you and not to them, because they disassociated themselves from the congregation and denied the foundation of the faith. You, likewise, blunt their teeth and tell them, because of this, that the Lord wrought for me when I went out of Egypt, for me and not for you. Had you been there, you would not have been redeemed. What does the simple child say? What is this? And you shall tell them, what with might of hand did the Lord take us out of Egypt from the house of bondage? And the one who does not know how to ask, you open for them, as it is written, and you shall tell your child on that day, etc.
Okay.
The context, Mechilta, Kirka 200s in Israel, is an early book of Midrash, rabbinic interpretation, in this case focused on the book of Exodus. Similar to how the Gemara takes apart the Mishnah and examines it phrase by phrase, Midrash does that to the Torah and to the Megillat. In this case, the verse in question is Exodus 13:14, which starts, if your child asks you tomorrow. Since there were times where the Hebrew word for tomorrow, machar, might have actually meant today, in Exodus 17:9, this needed to be discussed. It seemed that a clear case of machar actually meant in the future was Deuteronomy 6:20, another source verse for the four children. And this leads us into the first discussion of the four children. Note that in the Mechilat, its version of the wise child's verse uses an interpretation from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Torah by 70 scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, in the 100 CE, which says, commanded us, unlike to traditional Masoretic text that says, commanded you. How does the verse line up in the Mechilta? Wise child, question, Deuteronomy 6:20, answer, Mishnah, B'Shachim 10:8, wicked child, question, Exodus 12:26, answer, Exodus 13:8. Simple child, question, Exodus 13:14, answer, Exodus 13:14. Can't ask child, question, none, answer, Exodus 13:8. For the child who does not know how to ask, and also the wise child in this version, Mechilta says that you are supposed to open for them. How would you go about doing that?
Thank you, Morris.
David, I'm sorry, I'm confused, but above it looks like the answer 13:8 is to the can't ask child and the wicked child, not the wise. Am I missing something?
Maybe, let's see. It's certainly possible that I got this confused. All right, so yes, and as they say in improv classes, it is true that the wicked child and the child who does not know how to ask are given the same verse as the source of their answer, Exodus chapter 13, verse 8. And you shall tell your child on that day, because of this that the Lord brought for me when I went out of Egypt. That being said, it also says in the Mechilta, which was not so clear from the breakdown I've provided, that the one who does not know how to ask, you open for them, as is written, you shall tell your child on that day. And in the wise child, what does the wise child say? What are the testimonies and statutes and the judgment that the Lord our God commanded us? You likewise open to him in the halachot of Pesach. We don't eat after the afikomen. So the child who does not know how to ask and the wicked child have the same verse. The child who does not know how to ask and the wise child, we are both told in both of these cases that you should, quote, open for them. So the question is, if you are opening for your child about the topic of Pesach, how do you go about doing so?
Well, you could ask your child, if it's before Pesach, what did we do last night? And what are we doing this night? And why, or what's the difference?
Good. Other thoughts?
I think you'd have to start that conversation before the Seder ever began, so that they had a somewhat of an understanding of what's coming up before them. I think children are quick to get bored. And if they know something is going to happen, they're maybe more alert, and that it may be their responsibility, so they pay attention. I could be totally wrong because my kids have been grown for so long, I don't know what they do.
Now, one of the anecdotes that I always tell during our Seder is a Jewish Nobel laureate physicist. Somebody asked him, sort of, how did you become a Nobel laureate? How did you become a scientist, actually? And he said, well, you know, all of my friends would come home from school and their mothers asked, "Nu, what did you learn in school today?" My mother always asked, "What good question did you ask?" So I think if I was dealing, and I try to do that with my granddaughter, I wish I knew this with my daughter, but try to always ask my granddaughter, you know, like, what did you ask in school? And I would say to these kids, you know, is there something that you really want to know?
I agree with that.
Well, that's exactly what David is doing with us, asking. I wanted to ask. He's asking us questions, and we're asking. I'm almost asking him a question. What is this about?
You're asking me a question. What is this about?
No, I'm saying this is a typical dialogue. The way we learn is by posing a question. What do you think about it? To see a provoking thought.
That's true.
So I mean, so we're applying the same discourse. So this is nothing new.
Yes.
Yeah, as Alan says, but I never had that experience as a child where someone asked me what was it about. We just so I'm learning things now that I never thought about decades ago, or how I would manage with my children. Because when they were growing up in Costa Rica in the beginning, there wasn't much of anything. So we were improvising around the table. We didn't have much material. Not when we first started.
Yeah.
So maybe this is something I can apply to my grandchildren.
True.
Never too late.
No.
It's important that the parent knows their child, pays attention to how they learn, what their attention span is, and addresses the question based on what they think the child will understand. The best way to express it.
Mm-hmm.
Realize how our child thinks, but the better you know the child, the better you can communicate.
And I think that's really important. And I think it's one of the issues with the categorizations. It's not that one's wise and one's wicked and one's simple and one doesn't ask. It's that children are different, each in their own way. And to know your child and know how to open up to them or help them understand our heritage, our tradition, what this is about, takes an individual approach with them. Maybe that's what this is about, that they're all different and we need, as the adults, to understand that they're different and to respond to them differently. to reach out to them, as you said.
You attend a Seder like my grandparents had with 30 or 40 people and a lot more than just 4 children. What questions do you allow the other children to raise? They don't feel left out.
I think I'm missing something, Herb. Are you saying that
Well,
if
this
there are only 4 children, you don't?
this says there are only 4 questions that are possible. And obviously, I think there must be many more questions that are possible.
When you say this says there are 4 questions that are possible, you mean the 4 children says that, or the
You
or
have
the
4,
4 questions?
you have 4 questions that sit here for the 4 different children. Question is, my question is that all the possible questions that can be asked? Or is that all the possible questions that can be answered?
Hmm.
There's no prohibition to asking more questions, but these are the 4 that just as you're beginning to ask questions now, Herb. And after we started talking about these 4, and you're asking other questions. So, why? I would think you might be able to use this as a minimum basis to start provoking a conversation, rather than just going through the mechanism of going through the Seder mechanic. That sounds interesting to me. What you're suggesting, ask more questions. That becomes a real study session.
I was also wondering, given that if we treat this as a minimum, can't the source answers also change in terms of having multiple answers to the types of questions or non-questions that would be posed by each of these 4? I don't know. That's what I was thinking.
But maybe, Herb, are you suggesting there's more types of personalities or types of gradations, and that we're not limited to just wise, wicked, simple, and can't ask?
No, I don't think you need different types of, you can classify the children any way you want. But first of all, the 4 children that come every year aren't going to ask the same 4 questions every year. I wouldn't think. They might be similar in terms of what they're looking for, but they're not going to be the exact same questions. But do we still give them the exact same answers? I'm not sure these answers are complete enough to satisfy any child. Like you say to the wise child, you do anything after the Afikomen. Well, what does that really tell him? Or her? Or they?
Right,
Find it.
huge.
Don't go looking for it or you'll not be able to eat any dessert.
Well, does that mean there won't be any dessert?
I don't know. To me, this
Well, in
is
the
a
Haggdah I was
really-
following that said that that's the history, have the lingering taste of the holidays, the lasting as you retire for the evening.
Right.
Rather than that's the end of it.
That's the way you know the wise child. They've eaten the dessert before the Afikomen, so because they've remembered from the prior year.
It's a possibility. The other possibility is that there was a time when things were so poor that there was really nothing left to eat after the Afikomen.
All right, let's move on to the Jerusalem Talmud, because I want to make sure that we actually make it all the way to the modern Haggdah before the end of our class period. All right, Paul, would you read this, please, from Rabbi Chia?
Rabbi Chia stated
The Torah spoke about 4 children, a wise child, a wicked child, a stupid child, and a child who does not ask. What does the wise child say? What are the testimonials, ordinance, laws that the eternal God commanded us? All she shall tell them, with a strong hand of the eternal lead us out of Egypt, the house of slaves. What does the wicked child say? What does this service mean to you? What is this exertion that you impose upon us every year? Since they excluded themselves from the community, all she should tell them, because of this did the Eternal do for me when I left Egypt. For me, God did it. For that child, God did not do it. If that child had been in Egypt, he would not have been worthy ever to be redeemed. What does the stupid child say? What's this? Tell him the rules of Passover, that one may not eat after the Afikomen. And what does this mean? That one does not leave one group and join another group to keep eating. With the child who does not know how to ask, you have to begin with and initiate with him. Rabbi Jose said, this is what the Mishnah says. If the child does not know how to ask, their parent instructs them.
Okay.
This is from the Jerusalem Talmud, commenting on the Mishnah and finishing around the year 400 CE. It is after the Mechilta was written, so it seems to be in conversation with that text. In the Jerusalem Talmud, we get an attribution of this section to Rabbi Chia, a student of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. There were 3 Rabbi Hias. This one was probably Rabbi Chia Bar Abba, not Rabbi Chia the Great, or Rabbi Chia ben Yosef, Bar Yosef. Since only Rabbi Chia Bar Abba was called Rabbi Chia, this lines up with the timeline of the Mechilta. Note that in Jerusalem Talmud, the wise child's verse is still using commands us, not commanded you. Here's how the verses line up in the Jerusalem Talmud. The wise child's question is from Deuteronomy chapter 6, line 20. His answer is from Exodus chapter 13, line 14. The wicked child, the question comes from Exodus 12, chapter 12, verse 26. The answer is Exodus 13, verse 8. The stupid child questions comes from Exodus 13, verse 14. Answers Mishnah Pesachim, chapter 10, verse 8. Can't ask question is from Exodus chapter 13, verse 8. The allusion, since the verse doesn't say the child will ask you, answer, not in the Torah. How do you feel about that change from the simple child to the stupid child? Adopt, adapt, or abolish that change. Stupid isn't so. The one thing my grandfather used to tell me, the only thing you could ever call a child is a bastard, because you could never make him a bastard. But if you call a child stupid, you'll make him stupid. So you can never say anything bad.
I'm having a lot of trouble with the labels that have been given to these children throughout our discussions, both last time and this time. And I will be as sensitive as I can in expressing my concern, because I know there are people out there who will strongly disagree with me. But I think whoever put this together, who wrote the Jerusalem Talmud and all of these Mishnayot, never had children. Or if they did, they weren't really a parent. They were too busy studying. They have no real understanding of what children are like. And that the wicked child, that's a horrible thing to call a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old, because you'll almost make that dream come true. Wicked can mean alienated, indifferent. Maybe he feels not part of the Jewish community for whatever reason. And to me, that all goes back to the parenting. And how is that child parented? Maybe in such a manner that this child became resistant and didn't quite cooperate with what he was asked to do. Maybe the innate problem was in the parenting. Stupid is a horrible thing to talk to a liberal child. Maybe this child was innocent, maybe just naive, maybe just couldn't quite formulate his or her thoughts the way his or her older brother or sister could. Doesn't mean they're stupid. Maybe they just needed assistance or guidance in how to present themselves. Can't ask a question. Maybe that child was never really taught how to think for him or herself. Maybe the parent made all the decisions for that child and didn't let the child make any decisions for himself. Even if they were the wrong ones, he would learn or she would learn from them. So all of this to me goes back to the type of parenting these kids had in the first place. And so I have a real hard time with the way the rabbis formulated types of children. But that's just me. So I would just abolish these labels and think of a whole new way to present this kind of discussion.
But aren't these really supposed to be aspects of each of us?
Well, yeah, because they're all possibly all aspects of one person. One person has a lot more than 4 aspects. And you may call somebody wicked because you understand what they're up to or what they've been through. It's where they've been and how they've been treated. We don't know enough about these kids to see these labels, very generalized labels on them.
There was a, when you think about the old Haggdahs, you know, there wasn't much thought given to the child's needs or anxieties or whatever levels of intelligence. They just got their hands wrapped if they didn't learn their prayers, their tefillah. You know, that it wasn't a kindness toward the child. So I think that's what I see represented here is a very simplistic labeling, categorizing without much depth. That I feel the same way. There's no depth here, I think, in terms of explaining. So
2,000 years ago, we didn't have psychologists, child psychologists and sociologists, but social workers who could distinguish or give us a better way to treat our children. That's all they ever knew.
Not quoting Mishnah or any Jewish text at all, but citing the great reference of Disney's Encanto. Labels are a burden to people oftentimes, and even the wise child label can be a burden. To Hindi, your point, I've found, Carol, I really agree. And yeah, they may not have had, social workers and psychologists, but maybe our text in the 21st century should learn from Disney and others about the burdens of labeling and get rid of or more seriously modify this section of the Haggdah.
Yeah.
I would wonder, just because if you scroll up to the beginning of this passage from the Talmud Yerushalmi, it notes it by describing it, of course, as a halacha. So my way to approach it first, I suppose, would be to wonder whether or not, what actually is the halacha here? Is the halacha here that the questions are being asked, or is the title itself that's attributed to each one of the children somehow part of the halacha?
Yeah, that's a good question. So halacha is just the Jerusalem Talmud's term for a new section. It's not actually, here's a law.
Oh, so
very misleading.
Okay. So this is not being presented, none of this is being presented as a law.
Correct.
Per se? Oh, okay. Well, I suppose then there would be much more flexibility than in how you would change it. I suppose you could change the titles, but I don't know what you would change it to. I don't know how you would go about editing the text. But there might be, based on just what I've heard here, for a modern context, quite a lot of reason to possibly update the titles, though I wonder how often the labels actually affect people. Because of course, all of these are done within a ritual context, so I wonder if they're even taken in another way. I wonder if children actually perceive these the same way that, adults would when this ritual occurs. So that might be something to think about. And I also wonder, I know that the term stupid here is used for one of the children. Is that actually what's, what is the word stupid, how we understand it in English? Is that actually what's implied by the Hebrew term here? Is it equivalent?
Tipesh, yes. Tipesh it's different from what the Mechilta says. That we're in Mechilta it says Tom, which is translated as simple usually. And Tipesh is the modern Hebrew word for stupid.
Oh, with the same connotations as the English term, I would assume. Oh, okay. I just wanted to make that clear because I know sometimes English words can, even though there could be a hypothetical translation, might have other implications. Yeah, I would say there's definitely grounds to edit it, but I don't know how you would. I'm not sure how you would go about it.
Yeah.
That'd be my thoughts. Thank you.
Couldn't you just say the first child, the second child, the third child, and the fourth child?
I think the whole thing would have to be redone, not just what to call a child, but the whole concept of what you're trying to get at with this whole presentation needs to be rethought.
Positive spin on it is that you want to draw the children into the process. So you want them to be part of their heritage, and they want them to know why, the translations and what we're thinking, and you want to encourage them to have ideas of their own. So from that standpoint, you could jump off, I guess, but you don't, I don't think you have to label the children in order to bring them into the conversation and ask them what their opinion, give them information, and then let them extrapolate from that. So.
Recognizing the time, I will point out two other questions about this text, and then we're going to move on. One is that in the quote, wicked child, the Jerusalem Talmud has a line that is only in the Jerusalem Talmud, not in the Mechilta, not in the modern Haggdah. What is the exertion which you impose on us every year? And so something to think about when you might have felt that Pesach was, preparing for Passover was an exertion that was being imposed on you. And if this helps you identify with this child in any way. And also that the Jerusalem Talmud in the Haggdah switched the answer for the wise child versus the simple child, saying that the question about like which child gets the rules of Passover versus which child gets God took us out of Egypt. So different things to think about how that could play out. Looking at step 4, I'm going to go through this because I want to make sure we get through everything. So we have, this is the modern Haggdah. The wise child, what are these testimonies, statutes, and judgments that the Lord our God commanded you? And you should say to them, you should not eat an afikomen after you have finished eating. The quote, evil child, what is this worship to you? So it points out to you and not to them. And since they've excluded themselves, you say, this is what God did for me when I left Egypt, which is a biblical verse. And it's for me, not for them. So if they'd been there, they wouldn't have been saved. The simple child, what is this? You say, God took us out of Egypt. And for the child who doesn't know how to ask, you open the conversation saying, we're doing this because this is what God did for me when I left Egypt. A note that the wise child's verse in the modern Haggadah uses the traditional Masoretic text. So whereas in the Mechilta and the Jerusalem Talmud, the interpretation of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 20 was, what are these laws that our God commanded us? By the time of the modern Haggadah, the Masoretic text was set in the 800s to say that that verse actually meant commanded you. And so now the wise child and the quote wicked child are both asking, what is this to you? And they seem to be excluding, they both seem to be excluding themselves from the conversation or from the ritual. But that wasn't the case in the earlier versions of this. And then questions about this that we're not going to get into because I'd like to show you what else we have in the source sheet for you to look at. The quote wicked child and the child who does not know how to ask get the same answer. And both the wise child and the quote wicked child ask about you getting commanded, but only the wicked child takes any heat for it in the modern Haggadah. All right, so those are the 4 steps that lead us from the Bible through the Mechilta, through the Jerusalem Talmud, and to the modern Haggadah. There are other ways of getting at the same idea. So for instance, Ben Aronin was a educator in the 50s, 60s, and 70s at Anshe Emet. He happens to also be the great uncle of my wife, but I was using this version before I knew that and before I knew her.
He was Howard's teacher at Anshe Emet.
Huh. Excellent. You seem to have turned out well, Howard. So he wrote a song called The Ballad of the Four Sons to the tune of Clementine. I'll sing the first verse for you and then you can figure out the rest on your own. Said the father to the children, at the Seder you will dine. You will eat your fill of matzah, you will drink 4 cups of wine. And so it goes through this. You'll get the source sheet. You can see the whole thing. And then I have a YouTube video of someone singing this, if you want to see how that plays out. Then there's a video version of the Four Sons done by Bim Bam, which gets at the same idea, but without the same text. And I thought that was a really good way of approaching it differently. There's a which of the 4 children are you quiz for those who are into quizzes. So different ways of getting at it. And then we have some appendices. So from A Different Night Haggadah, there are different ways of illustrating these 4 children dating back to the 1500s. And so the source sheet has different illustrations and then an example of like a discussion about each of them. Prague, Amsterdam, 1500s, 1600s, the immigrant family in the Chicago Haggadah in the late 1800s. We've got stick figures. We've got Poland in 1939. We've got Israel, the early modern state of Israel. Just going through this quickly, but you'll be able to go through it on your own later. We've got the 4 aspects in each of us from the Rabbinical Assembly Haggadah. This one I think bears looking at. We've got claymation. We've got the 4 children as 4 books, which you can interpret in at least 3 different ways, which goes with which book. We've got the 4 daughters. So a variety of things. Then in Appendix B, we have the 5th child, different ways of thinking about who is the 5th child. The Lubavitcher Rebbe suggests in 1957 that this is the assimilated child who's not even sitting at the table at all, whereas the wicked child is there. We have the child of potential. So the one from parents that are struggling with infertility and pregnancy loss. We have the child lost to gun violence. We have the addicted child. We have the estranged child.
Oh my God.
So many ways of, and then a whole set of other possible things. So many ways of taking what is going on in our lives and bringing it into our holiday celebrations. More ones. And then we've got other interpretations of the four children. So, which aren't the four children who are in mourning, the children who are healing from trauma, the activist children, there are the four children having to do with COVID that came out in 2020. I know I'm going through this quickly. And then later on, the four daughters, a couple sets of those. So I'm going to stop our share